Well, welcome to the Red Chair. Today we have a very special guest, Yaron Brooke. You say you're just a finance guy, but in reality, you're an author, a podcaster, and a big defender of objectivism.
Yes.
So why would we have you here at the Red Chair? Who are you?
I'm a finance guy. I really did start my career to a large extent in finance. I got a PhD in finance, the University of Texas in Austin. I was a finance professor for many years. I was involved in running a hedge fund for a long time. Also, dabbled in private equity and venture capital, but wasn't particularly good at it. So
in the golden days,
in the
right?
golden days,
You'll have to tell us all about that.
So stuck to the hedge fund side, which was more based on kind of research I had done as a finance professor. But then, I've always been passionate about Ayn Rand. I discovered Ayn Rand when I was 16, when somebody handed me a copy of Atlas Shrugged, and I read it, and it changed my life. It really changed my whole orientation about the world and how I see the world and how I see my own life. And
Can you summarize what she stands for?
She stands for a morality of rational self-interest, a morality that basically says your purpose in life should be your own happiness and your own long-term rational values. Happiness is not just a momentary high. It's not just joy in the moment. It's a state of being that you carry over a lifetime, and it requires certain principles. It requires a certain attitude towards life, and the key to all of that for her was reason, rationality. And I'd been brought up very much as you sacrifice, you do your duty. You sacrifice to the state, you sacrifice to your people, you sacrifice to your family, you sacrifice to the tribe. And I grew up in Israel, and Israel was very collectivist and very oriented towards the state and the value of the state. And this was a revolution for me. So she stands for rational egoism, long-term rational self-interest, an advocacy for reason. Reason is the way in which we know the world. We don't get it from revelation. We don't get it from ancient books. We get it from interacting with reality, and facts are facts, and your emotions don't change those facts. So you have to really cultivate your reason. And that the only political system appropriate for rational beings, for people who want to pursue their own happiness long-term, is a system of capitalism, a system of freedom. So that's kind of very succinctly what she stands for. And that really captured me when I was 16. I mean, it really, so I landed up reading everything she wrote and studying her ideas for many, many years. And in 2000, I was approached by the Ayn Rand Institute, which was an institute created after she died to promote her work in the world. And they offered me the job of CEO of the institute, which was an amazing opportunity, which I took. I did that for 17 years. I'm now the chairman of the board of the institute. I dedicated, the last 30 years to kind of promoting these ideas, the ideas of liberty, the ideas of freedom, the ideas of individuals pursuing their own happiness.
Now, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
But before we get and connect this to the ecosystem of entrepreneurship and finance and venture capital, tell me about your Silicon Valley experience at the time, because, this is, after all, we are VCs. And so what happened in the late 90s? What did you see?
It was pretty crazy. So if you study American business history, you find that whenever there's something really exciting and very new, there is overinvestment in that field. And the overinvestment makes sense because you don't know who the winners and losers are. You know that as a venture capitalist. So a lot of money flows in, and a lot of wealth gets destroyed ultimately. But the winners are huge.
Yeah,
are huge.
And hopefully compensate for the others.
And they compensate. And if you look at the dot-com bubble, if you look at pre-post, a huge amount of wealth in net was created, even though a lot of wealth in the midterm was destroyed. On net, huge amount of wealth was created. So, I was in Silicon Valley in the late 1990s. Both I was a finance professor and had the experience of my third-rate students becoming CFOs of startups, right? And something's wrong when you're a student who doesn't know much finance suddenly is a CFO. Yeah. So it was crazy. It was insane. People starting startups. If you added a .com to your company name, there was a period where you just added the .com. your valuation went up dramatically. You know, in my hedge fund, I've been a investor in banks for a very long time, small community banks in the U.S. And there was a period in April 1999. I know this because I wrote a paper on this. In April 1999, any bank that announced an internet strategy doubled, tripled for a few days and then came back down to earth. So it was really, it was you know, capital chasing, returns, crazy. In those days, you didn't have kind of the, what do you call the meme stocks, but you had the equivalent. You had Yahoo chat boards where people would chat about this, rumors would spread and people would invest. But we worked for a high net worth investor at the time and made some investments in the Valley for him. And it was an interesting period. I got to meet a lot of venture capitalists, made some investments with some of those venture capitalists. Overall, I think we did okay. We also made some direct investments in companies. Timing was pretty bad. We were kind of
in some VC funds as well.
And we invested in VC funds, private equity funds. And
a particular case that you remember that was
well, it turned out that we were among the first investors in Union Square, which was the first investor in Twitter. In just the Twitter IPO a few years ago, returned more than that fund, and you know, which is a pretty common experience among the successful venture capitalist funds in the United States. You know, so you know, but we also invested. I remember we did a co-investment with Sequoia. You know, Sequoia, right? I mean, and it basically took 9 months for the company to go through $63 million and go bankrupt. So
that rings a bell.
It's Sequoia, right?
It still happens today.
And it even happens to Sequoia, right? Yeah. So
now it's all SoftBank.
Yes, SoftBank, $63 million is penny change for them. But yeah, so you know, you discover that it's venture capital is its own universe. It requires real skill. The people who are good at it, you know, are good at it for a reason. It's not just crazy. It's not just luck. Even smart people, I consider myself relatively smart. Finance, you know, we can't compete with the Sequoias and the Kleiner Perkinses of the world. But it's an incredibly exciting area. And again, while in 2000, of course, the market collapsed and NASDAQ lost 75% of its value. You know, we got out of that boom, right? We got Amazon, and we got ultimately you got Google, and you got a bunch of these companies that today dominate the market. And so those investments were not for nothing. You also got a massive infrastructure. The whole infrastructure of the internet, to a large extent, it received massive investment during that period of time.
For sure.
The cell phones, you wouldn't have an iPhone without the investments that went in during that period of time. So it was super exciting. It was a lot of fun. It's not something I'm particularly good at, so I backed off. You know, you have to know what you're good at and what you're not good at. But look, it's where the world changes, right? Venture capital is the industry that changes the world.
It's the creative destruction in practice, right?
Absolutely, and with a primary emphasis on creative, right? The destruction happens, but the focus is on the creative.
Yes. So let's go. We were talking just before this about a couple of examples of entrepreneurs that maybe they're a bit selfish, and whether they actually suffer the consequences, the good or the bad consequences of being selfish. And we were talking, for example, about WeWork. Do you think that the current market and sort of the ethos of the time, which is to be, you know, founders thinking about themselves and, you know, getting everything up front, and even, you know, even let's say social media, where, you know, there's this selfie culture. It's like me. Is that the right way to do it?
No, because I think the selfie and I think some founders, not all founders, but certainly some founders, the focus is on whim. The focus is on emotion. The focus is, I want this, like the 3-year-olds, right?
I want this percentage.
I want this percentage. I want this now.
VCs, by the way.
And it's, and it's now, and it's all driven by emotion. And I think success is driven by reason. Success is driven by the mind. Success is driven by long-term thinking. Success is driven by, you know, really thinking through these issues and figuring out what you really want in life. And this is true, by the way, not just in the venture capital world. This is true in life. Right? To the extent that you become a whim worshiper, that you follow just the emotion of the moment, to that extent, you're probably not going to do that well. Even if you might do well financially, you won't get the same level of satisfaction if you have built it versus people who really are, more rational, more considerate, think things through and pursue for themselves, but the real values, the values that are really going to make a difference in their lives. And I think that's true again at the personal level. Be thoughtful, think long term, pursue values that are meaningful long term, not just satisfying emotion right now. And I think that's definitely true. I don't get the selfie culture. I mean, who cares, right? I think I've taken one or two selfies in my life.
An expression of sort of self-centered world.
It's an expression, I think, of emotionalism. It's an expression. This generation has been taught, at least in American schools, that the most important thing is their emotion. They're not taught how to think. They're not taught math or science, and they're not really taught facts, but they're taught to feel good about themselves. It's all about feeling good. And if you feel good about yourself, you're not going to feel good about yourself, right? At the end of the day, you're not going to have the self-esteem, the confidence, the self-assuredness that comes from actually doing stuff.
Because you need to find some challenge it.
You need to challenge yourself. You need to push yourself. You need to fail. You need to learn from failure. I mean, the great value of Silicon Valley, I think, and what makes Silicon Valley so unique is the attitude towards failure and the willingness to fail and the willingness to learn and get up and start over. But it's to challenge yourself and really push yourself. It's what entrepreneurs, I think the better entrepreneurs do all the time. And it's rare to find a really, really successful entrepreneur who hasn't failed, who hasn't fallen on his face. Maybe Steve Jobs is the best example of that, right? You get fired from your own company, you go into the wilderness, and then you come back a triumph. I mean, that is the ultimate Silicon Valley story. And if you think about Steve Jobs, he was a thinker, a long-term thinker, and somebody who even though he died young, you have a sense that he lived a full life. He was satisfied, he was happy, and he left a mark on the world. But he also, just his presence, right, on stage and the way he carried himself, he was a man of self-esteem. He was a real man versus these children who just want, and just live for a momentary desire. Here's somebody who planned a life over the long run and lived an incredibly successful life. So, I think this me, it's not about the me, it's about me as an emotion, rather me as a rational being thinking about a long-term arc in which I live and how to live the best life. And the same thing I think goes with founders. Successful founders, I think, have a long-term perspective on their companies. It's the failed founders, who everything has to be short-term, and then they crash. And some of the examples we talked about, WeWorks is a good example. I mean, everything was short-term. There was no real projection long-term and looking to the numbers and what actually adds up. And it crashed. Now, he managed somehow to deceive his investors in a way that he landed up walking away with a couple of $1 billion, which is bizarre why anybody would let him do that. But he crashed the company that he built his reputation around, and he crashed it because he was short-term and because he was focused on emotion rather than on real planning.
But isn't it an example of how sometimes if you are sort of focusing on yourself and on the short-term gain, you end up damaging society for the long term? Don't we need some sort of balance beyond just self-interest, because people are not rational and people do not think long-term, and so they are willing to trade short-term gains against longer-term demise of the whole thing.
So to me, the person who seeks the short-term gain is not being self-interested. They're being self-destructive. And yes,
but he got the money.
Sure, but life is not about money. I mean, I know that's hard for people to understand, but life's not about money, right? We all hopefully, some of us have choices, and we often choose against our monetary interests. I mean, I could have much easier gone to Wall Street and made a lot of money than gone to become a finance professor and then run a think tank, a philosophy think tank where you make no money, right? So, you do hopefully you get an opportunity to do what you love in life and not just, and you can combine it with making some money, but it's not just about the money. And most of them don't make a lot of money. I mean, again, the WeWork guy is an exception. Most founders who crash their companies crash their companies. They don't do well.
Yeah.
And sometimes they can rise up, but if they crash the company because of their own stupidity, their own short-term perspective, they will have a hard time getting funding for the second round if they don't show that they've grown and matured. So it's very, very rare that this kind of short-termism pays off, even financially. Now, once in a while it happens, but it's rare. And it hurts the person, and it hurts us, and it hurts everybody around him. It hurts the investors, it hurts the employees, the stakeholders, everybody gets hurt. So what I'm advocating for is not a short-termist self-interest. I'm advocating for people should pursue their long-term rational self-interest. And when they do, they are more likely to be successful. No guarantees in life, but they're more likely to be successful. And as they're being successful, just like the stakeholders suffer when you collapse, they benefit when you succeed. So other people succeed with you if you do it right. And what is the incentive to do it right? It's that you're going to be successful. And I do think that people who do it wrong, they fail. And while, we'll see what happens ultimately to the guy from WeWorks, I think he failed. He failed big time. I don't think he's learned his lesson, and I think he's going to fail again.
Right. And that's kind of like what happened to Elizabeth Holmes as well, but she's in jail.
Well, she's in jail, and Bernie Madoff is in jail. And look, if you commit fraud, if you lie, cheat, steal, you're going to get caught. And if you don't get caught, you're going to be constantly looking over your shoulder. Bernie Madoff tells a story that he was happier in jail than he was before he was caught. Because before he was caught, he constantly lived a life looking over his shoulder, checking, who's going to catch me? Who am I lying to? It's impossible to live that way. So a good life, and everybody should try to live a good life, is a life without lying, cheating, and stealing. It's pretty straightforward.
Now, partially, from what I understand, you also defend extremely light regulation beyond, nothing much more than beyond private property rights and the rule of law in a minimal sense.
Yes, I believe
Why is that?
I believe the government is there. Government is force. Government is coercion. You break the law, you go to jail, or you get fined, or something physical happens to you. And the only appropriate use of force and coercion is protection. It's to protect us from the bad guys, from crooks and thieves and criminals. So the job of government is primarily play defense. It's to protect us from invaders and terrorists and crooks and criminals. But other than that, when the two of us are interacting and try to cut a deal, or trying to pursue some kind of trade, it's none of anybody's business unless one of us is committing fraud, unless one of us is using a fist or a gun. The government has no business in intervening. Now, it could be that it's a bad deal, but then we'll both suffer the consequences.
But what if, for example, one of the parties does not have all the information, right? If you're having huge asymmetries of information, shouldn't there be some sort of intervention for the greater good?
No, because there's never symmetrical information. In every circumstances, in every transaction, everywhere, there's always some asymmetrical information. Yeah. If only I know what my true skills are. You're a venture capitalist, and I know what my true skills are. I might present very nicely, but I know there's asymmetrical information about who I am and what I'm willing to do. There's asymmetrical information everywhere. When they're extreme, there's a market opportunity. So, for example.
But is there really? Or is
always.
It that the bad coin expels the good coin? Let's say, for example, in food regulation, right? If you're allowed to do whatever you want, you might, we might push bad things into people's mouths.
Absolutely. But then think about an opportunity that creates for a company to start up, a venture-backed company, not just to do good food, to rank the food other companies do. Imagine if there was a label, right? Article, every day. Here's what's in all the food. Here's the good food. Here's the bad food. Don't buy the bad food. Imagine if your local newspaper published these lists, and that there was a way.
The newspaper is controlled by the guys from the bad food.
Yeah, then start another newspaper that competes with that newspaper. These scenarios, they don't work out in a real marketplace. Their incentives always, particularly when there's lack of information, It is incentive to provide information. If the government isn't deciding which drugs to sell and which drugs not to sell, health, medicine.
Yes, medicine.
Then do we really need the government to set up an FDA, or is there an opportunity for a startup to say we're going to test all these drugs, and we're going to let the doctors know which drugs are good and which drugs are not, and there'll be competition. So some companies might be better at reading the drugs than other companies. And by the way, we're not going to just ban drugs. We're going to say, look, here are the risks, here are the benefits, and maybe doctors and patients can make decisions about which drugs they're willing to take given the risk and benefit trade-off that are happening. How about we treat human beings as adults, and instead of treating them as children, where there's one authority telling them what's okay and what's not?
Well, I mean, not all adults are equal, as we all know.
Yeah, but the more you treat them,
education is different.
Sure, but the more we treat them as children, the more we encourage them to be children. So, but the more we elevate them, the more we raise our expectations. This is true of children. If you take children and you don't expect anything from them, if you expect them to stay stupid, they will stay stupid. And good schools challenge, good parents challenge their kids, push their kids, elevate their kids to become ultimately adults who can function by themselves. And I think the same is true in a culture. If we create a culture that spoon feeds everybody the information and the what's good for you and what's not good for you, you don't have to worry about it. Don't think for yourself. Don't do anything for yourself. Then we get a dumb culture.
Right. So, but you could argue that the US has been more sort of on the side of self-interest, and Europe more on the side of sort of common interest. But look at the results. What happened here? So are we now in the hands of, is it a smart culture when you have people deciding by themselves and less regulation? Although apparently there'll be less regulation, which is probably good in some areas. But are we now?
Well, I mean, look, 60 to 70% of all medical innovations happen in the United States. Almost all tech innovation happens in the U.S. I mean, how many unicorns exist in Europe, for example? How many unicorns are outside?
They become American, right? All the Portuguese, they become American.
They partially become American because
that's where the money is.
That's where but it's not just where the money. It's where the talent is, the skill is, the venture, the people willing to take risks on them. And venture capital is not a large industry in Europe, partially.
Yeah.
So yeah, but so there's a. And the talents over there, and being in Silicon Valley has huge benefits. So yes, there's a huge upside for being the kind of unregulated America. And I'd say over the last 40, 50 years, the United States has suffered from becoming more like Europe. It's become more tribal. It's becoming more collectivistic. It's becoming less individualistic. It's heavily regulated in some ways and in some industries, more regulated than Europe. Denmark is less regulated. You'd rather have a bank in Denmark than a bank in the United States. Banks in Denmark are less regulated than the United States. So in many respects, the United States, as it's become more like Europe, it's dumbed down its own people. And the quality of people, the quality of thinking, the quality of the culture, American culture, has deteriorated. It's deteriorated as regulations have increased, not as they've decreased, but as they've increased. As the state has become bigger, I mean, government spending only goes in one direction in the United States, whether they have the money or not. They spend it. That, again, is a form of control because it means the government is doing a lot, and that dumbs down the culture. So what we're seeing is the dumbing down of the culture in America as government becomes bigger and more engaged in people's lives.
Do you think now in this new scenario we're going to have sort of a techno-libertarian bent, and that is going to change the U.S. System completely, or is it really possible?
So I'm very skeptical about the ability of many of these tech guys to really make fundamental change. I think it's rare that fundamental change comes from the top. It usually comes from the bottom through some kind of revolution or some kind of uprising of the people or some kind of change, cultural change. It's very difficult to impose it from the top. Elon Musk would like to cut $2 trillion off of the American budget, but the American people don't want $2 trillion cut, because to cut $2 trillion, you have to cut Social Security, and you have to cut Medicare. Nobody's willing to do that. So I think there's a lot of fantasy going on right now, and they think they can do this and they think they can do that, and all the venture capitalists are coming to Washington and they're all excited and thrilled. But once they realize the kind of work that they're going to have to do, the schmoozing, the dealing with politicians and dealing with committees, and they're going to realize this is going to be a lot more difficult.
So you have to actually, you cannot just direct people
You actually have to, we're not a dictatorship in the United States, not yet. And you actually have to work through Congress and through the Senate and ultimately through the court system. And it takes years and it takes a long time. And I don't think venture capitalists have the patience. And I don't think it's the kind of work they used to. We invest, we don't invest. We invest, they make the decision. Mark Andreessen doesn't go to begging to Congress. He just makes a decision on how he's allocating the capital. And suddenly these guys are going to have to go in front of Congress, and they're going to have to convince Congress, and they have to write bills and make changes. And a lot of the people in Congress are young kids who are working as aides to the senators and congressmen, and they make the decisions. It's much more complicated and much more difficult, and they'll get resistance from the American people. And of course, I don't think at the end of the day that's what Donald Trump wants. I don't think Donald Trump wants a bunch of Silicon Valley venture capitalists running his show. He wants the attention. No, he doesn't want them to get the attention. So I'm skeptical about the ability to be successful.
But are you sort of long-term positive on the US and by the way, on Europe? What's your view? It's taking into account, these sort of divergent cultural trends.
I mean, I think we're entering a very difficult period culturally, both in the United States and in Europe. And I think the trends right now are negative. They're not positive. I think there's a rising voice of authoritarianism, both in the United States and in Europe. And of course, you've got Putin at the fringes manipulating some of this. And with a lot of sympathy from people in the U.S. and some people in Europe. So I think Europe and the United States are going to reach a tipping point soon where they're going to have to decide. Are we heading towards great authoritarianism and, in a sense, turning our backs on Western civilization? Or are we going to recommit ourselves in America to the founding principles and in Europe to the Enlightenment principles that made Europe what it is? And it's going to be close. I don't know how it tilts, but it's coming. I think it's going to happen soon, and I think there's a real battle right now for the soul of what Western civilization is.
And what would you say the sort of consequences for entrepreneurship?
Well, one, if we recommit ourselves to Western civilization, that means we recommit ourselves to economic liberty, at least to some extent. And that's great for entrepreneurs. And on the other side, if we abandoned, I think, the principle of economic liberty, we abandon the principles of liberty more broadly, and we embrace more authoritarian style of government. There are not that many entrepreneurs in Hungary. There are not that many entrepreneurs in Russia, and in China, it's a disappearing breed. Right, it's dwindling, and so it's not good if we make the wrong choice about the direction and towards the future for entrepreneurs.
Well, on that note, Yaron, was great to have you here.
Absolutely, this was a pleasure.
A short talk. We could talk for hours and
Absolutely.
hours and go much deeper.
Absolutely.
But this is what it is. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much.